Tell me about your recent work on consciousness.
Yeah, so I'm what you'd call a computational neuroscientist, which means that I'm really interested in understanding how the brain works. And to do so, I use tools and techniques that kind of have a computational nature. They often involve techniques from physics or complex systems or mathematics. And we try to essentially build little toy models of the brain that don't work exactly like a brain. You couldn't kind of plug and play inside your own brain to have them function the way that your brain works, but they tried to mimic different elements of the organization of the brain to try to kind of understand why would the brain be organized the way that it is. And recently we've gotten really interested in trying to understand some of the kind of bigger questions in neuroscience, which are around this kind of concept of what it means to be conscious and aware of the world around us. To the fact that we can have this conversation right now requires that we have a complete, fully functioning nervous system, which does some pretty fascinating stuff. And so we've been trying to think about ways that we could conduct experiments and test hypotheses about the organization of the brain as it pertains to giving rise to our conscious experience of the world.
Right. I mean, contextualize for me kind of where then, how much of neuroscientists trying to think about like consciousness? I mean, there's kind of a feeling of experience. I mean, is that something that needs to be explained? It's on the one level, it's like if we have eyes, if we have all these senses, I mean, there must be some way the brain is inputting this stuff. But so what is the additional thing that we need to explain when we talk about consciousness, and how have you found trying to think about the specific things that one would need to think about in order for the brain to sort of generate consciousness?
Yeah, look, it's a really great question, and it's one that has quite a kind of storied history of philosophy behind it. And to be perfectly frank with you, I think people are still trying to figure out the right way to frame questions about what consciousness even is. It's kind of this notoriously difficult um, sort of term to define in the first place. Um, and part of the reason that people, I think, want to try to sort of take it on its own and study it as a sort of phenomena, aside from, let's say, perception or something like that, is that there are lots of things that a brain or a human can do or an animal can do with a brain, an intact brain, when they're insensate from the world, in the sense that they couldn't respond to you and say that they were awake, but they still function as though they appear like they're processing the external world. So one of the classic examples that people figured out, back in the day, this is going back in number of years to some of the early studies, first recordings of humans that were undergoing neurosurgery, was that you could stimulate the brain with, let's say, a visual flash, and you could record from different parts of the brain, and they would be completely indistinguishable whether or not that person had been given an anesthetic. In other words, their consciousness had been removed, or if they were actually awake and perceiving the world. And then there'd be other parts of the brain where there'd be completely different responses. So you could imagine moving your probe from area 1 to area 2, and now all of a sudden you have a huge difference between whether the subject's actually awake and conscious and can respond to your every question or not. And it creates this really interesting challenge for scientists. You then say to yourselves, well, what is it about the brain that's changed? It was still structurally the same. We didn't remove any neurons or glia. We didn't change the blood flow to the brain at all. We've given an anesthetic drug, which has an interesting set of questions in how those work, but we can put that to the side. But you've given an anesthetic drug, and it's changed something. It's changed the ability for context to be brought to bear on responses. It changed the ability for you to combine information together from your past experience to bring that to bear on your response. And it's removed this kind of more robotic style of responding to the external world and given it a context dependency. And that's a really, really interesting capacity. And I think one that doesn't necessarily just vary in a kind of binary sense, like a light switch. It's not that you just have it or you don't. I think there's a big difference between being unconscious and conscious, but then once you're actually awake, this can actually vary to a large extent. And so you might compare, a friend of yours who's a little bit more, let's say, concrete, and they really everything they see, they just respond to, versus a friend that's very thoughtful. And every time you ask them a question, they have to think back to the past when they've had an experience that is a bit like that to give you some advice. And so these are now, you can imagine, a grade of different kinds of context dependency that are changing across individuals and maybe across the waking day. So there's a really interesting phenomena there, I think, to understand. And, just as a kind of a curiosity-driven neuroscientist, it's really one of these big questions. Like, what is it about the way that our brains are organized that gives rise to this ability to sense the world and to experience anything at all? And then once you find out some of those clues, how far back could you track those structures? And then, how far back should we be willing to give some of these same capacities to different animals? When I interact with my dog or one of my dogs in my house, are they conscious? Now, I think undeniably so, but then their brains are pretty similar to a cat, pretty similar to a rabbit, pretty similar to even things like reptiles, frogs and fish and octopi. And so you start sort of pushing this thing back further and further, and you come up with these really, really interesting sort of insights, I think, into just how complex life is on our planet and how precious it is.
Right. I mean, on that point, it's interesting, and I'm gonna have some specific podcasts almost distinguishing between what do we mean by consciousness, right? So probably it seems, why wouldn't your dog be conscious? But then, is there something to do with language? Like, is there kind of meta consciousness, which is something different? And it's I didn't realize that was a kind of problem, something we noticed. So there could be brain activity, you could stimulate it, but then no kind of conscious response. And so but then there are sometimes you can actually, and then that makes me think. So I remember I talked to Mark Soames, and we talked a bit about anesthetics. So okay, and so is that still something that needs to be explained? Like, anesthetics work on parts of the brain, and they can kind of turn off consciousness, but it's not like it affects everything. It's not like all systems are completely like shut off. It's so, and then maybe you could study that and be like, what actually are the specific things that are enabling and allowing consciousness?
It's actually quite fascinating and maybe slightly disturbing for everyone who's undergone surgery where you've been made unconscious with an anesthetic, that we actually really still don't know. We don't have like a kind of central theory for exactly how different anesthetic agents work. And probably the leading theory is that they increase what's called inhibition in the brain. They increase the ability for brain signals to turn brain neurons to turn other neurons' activity down. So you can imagine that a neuron could come in and affect another neuron and increase its activity. You can do the same thing in the other direction. And the idea is that anesthetics increase the likelihood that this inhibition will work. They're kind of a little bit like the librarians going around shushing everyone. If you have enough of them shushing in the library, no real conversations can happen between neurons. But it turns out that this is kind of problematic because there are other anesthetic drugs you can give that actually don't have a clear mechanism that increases the inhibition in the brain. My favorite example is actually the noble gas xenon is actually an anesthetic agent that works quite well. And if you remember your high school chemistry, noble gases are actually inert. They don't have any spare electrons that can interact with other chemicals. So they can't actually interact in the way that all the other kind of covalent or ionic bonds are made in chemistry. So there's something deeply mysterious about the site of action. So putting that to the side, though, there actually are some other ways that you can make progress here as neuroscientists. You can go through and you can say, irrespective of how an anesthetic agent works, whether or not it's xenon or one of these inhibition boosters or something altogether different, are there downstream effects that impact the nervous system in the same way? And from there, can we build up an understanding of what's different between conscious and unconscious? And so we were really inspired by some work done by a group in Germany. Matthew Larkham, who's actually an expat Australian working over in Germany at the Humboldt University. They have a really beautiful series of studies that have tracked back, 15 to 20 years, showing that one of the main effects of anesthesia is to essentially decouple different compartments within cells in your cortex. So I'll unpack that a little for you. The cortex is the kind of outer layer of the human brain. Is kind of the wrinkly outer part that you'll see if you Google the term brain online. It's quite convoluted sheet of these different cells that are all kind of interconnected with one another. And it turns out that within that convoluted sheet, if you were kind of to take a little biopsy of one part of it, or to sort of stick a microscope on one part, you'd see that a lot of the cells are actually oriented vertically, so that on the outside of the brain, the sort of, you can almost imagine the sort of upper part of a tree, the kind of bushy leaves of a tree are sitting at the top. And then there's these long stalks, a little bit like a palm tree, that go deep down into the brain. And just before the interface between the cortex and the rest of the brain, they have their what's called cell body. It's kind of like the roots of the tree. And it turns out it's really quite fascinating. These different parts of this cell, the top of the tree and the roots of the tree, receive completely different streams of input. So Matthew's actually shown that the kind of sensory inputs that you receive from the world, they're going to be much more likely to hit those bottom parts of the tree, whereas your expectations about what would happen actually project to the top parts of the tree. And when those two parts interact, you actually get a really, really different effect in your brain. This big burst firing of this cell, it just goes absolutely bananas. And it turns out that spiking that you see in the cell when these two streams interact actually coincides with your conscious experience of a stimulus. Now, I say your, but I mean here a mouse in an animal model of this perceptual experience. So what Matthew's done, which I think is really fascinating, is that he's shown that multiple different types of anesthetic drugs actually block the ability for that expectation and the evidence to match together. And you basically block the ability for this cell to respond in that really big bursty way to those coincident inputs. And the reason this is really, really exciting is it suggests that irrespective of which anesthetic agent you use, a way to block an animal's ability to actually combine context with input actually can turn on and off conscious experience in a really physical way. So in my group, then what we've done is we've sort of tried a little bit like a relay race. A lot of science is a big relay race, right? You take the baton from a brilliant group that's come before you who did the same thing for people that came before them, and you try to just inch it forward a little bit. And so what we've tried to do is essentially take this concept of these different streams of information coming into a cell, being able to switch it on and off, and to build that into little models where we can then ask, okay, if we have a little model of this system, and we ask what kinds of things can cause that switch to open or close, or we ask what happens when a group of these things all work together, and the one that's bursting now can impact another one, it can impact another one, etc. All these kinds of really, really difficult things to imagine, but very, very easy to write into a computer program. We can then ask, what is the signature of their effective kind of organization in different ways? And it turns out, to cut a long story short, that you can recapitulate a number of different signatures that people have found empirically when they look at someone's brain that is in a coma versus awake. The difference between those can be recapitulated in our model in a really, really exciting way. So it suggests that you can take something really physical, like a cell that is combining or not these different input streams, and you can scale it up to actually understand the kinds of things you can measure as someone in a hospital, or you and I sitting here having this conversation. And that's what we're really excited about, is this ability to essentially take something that seems so ineffable, right, our conversation, and build it up from a biological basis.
And to see if I can kind of understand it, it's interesting that you kind of say there actually is this need for the expectations from ourselves, and the sensory input seems kind of actually important for consciousness, such that, if you block, you can still have the expectations maybe. If there's a sensory input, what can you do? And equally, if there's sensory input, but then you're not really able to make sense of that and think, well, would you, kind of expect to see how should I be interpreting what the sensory information? Then there seems to be kind of no consciousness. So, and then what you're doing is kind of, if we can actually look at, okay, that's like an important thing, and then what more generally is going, a broader scale is going on in the brain, and then what more can that tell us about consciousness, if we can kind of model that, and then we're sort of seeing what dynamics more broadly are important for facilitating consciousness. So, tell me a bit more about your work there.
Yeah, so it's important to state at this stage that this idea of expectation and evidence matching leading to consciousness is not a new idea. That's been around for some time, and there's some really beautiful work. Victor Lama had some really lovely work on this that I read back when I was a grad student. that was quite inspirational to me. But again, and Matthew had also done a lot of work to that end before we came along. The part that we're trying to add to this sort of very complex puzzle is taking very seriously this notion of sort of the organization of the brain being particularly useful for some of the things that we're capable of doing. And so if you look at this notion of these cells that can integrate your expectations with the evidence that comes in, it turns out that they're connected and that coupling between these two compartments is influenced and kind of modulated by a number of other structures that have also been shown by others to be deeply important for consciousness. So one of them is the thalamus, which is a really deep structure in the brain, which we're really interested in. And then the other one is known as the reticular activating system, or it's part of what's called the brainstem. So these structures are much, much deeper in the brain than the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is kind of a central processing hub. And then the brainstem is kind of the core, really deep kind of in your neck that supports many really basic physiological functions. So there's parts of your brainstem that control your heart rate and control your breathing rate and your ability to balance. It also has the highways that send all the messages from your body up to your brain and your brain back down to your body. So anything that comes in or goes out has to go through the brainstem. But interspersed in amongst all of those different circuits are this really interesting set of regions, different nuclei, neurons, that project really diffusely up into the brain. And in particular, they actually are projected to areas that help this coupling turn on or off. And so we're really interested in whether or not different elements of this system could actually facilitate different types of emergent activity in a system that was built of these little toys. So you can imagine this a little bit like playing with Lego and setting the puzzle, the Lego piece to be this particular neuron that can couple things together and do this interesting burst firing. What we're essentially doing is saying, what if we built a model like that versus the way that people would traditionally build models, which is just that each neuron sums up all of its inputs and then does a little spike. That's called an integrate and fire neuron. We've got a different type of a puzzle, sort of Lego block at the start. And the question is, can that do really interesting things? Can that compute in different ways? Can that provide different types of kind of computational signatures? And it turns out that it can do lots of very interesting things that are coincident with predictions that people have made in the community from a completely different perspective, thinking about what would be the benefit of being conscious versus not, or what would the mechanism of a conscious thought versus an unconscious thought be? And we can kind of find some of those signatures using our model in a way that we find really, really exciting.
It's interesting that one often thinks about consciousness and the higher order capacities of humans are sort of residing in the cortex and in the outer layers of the brain. But if you're saying, go down deeper into the sort of like near the brainstem regions, and see actually, okay, there is consciousness, and so actually, how are they mediating different kinds of consciousness? And also, I mean, tell me more about, so cognitive scientists, and you say have this model of neurons. Often they sort of they fire at a certain point once sort of they reach a threshold, or I mean they have weights, and then the way you're thinking about it is, well, what is this different way of thinking about it, of how neurons could fire, and why would you think about it like this? What?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to get into on a general podcast, but we'll do our best. A lot of really brilliant insights have been required to get us to the point we're at now in computational neuroscience. And I don't have time to cover the sort of full history, but one of the really huge insights that really helped computational neuroscientists was this notion that you could take the complexity of a neuron. If you looked at one of these things under a microscope, you'd feel like you were kind of walking through the forest looking at an individual tree and trying to describe it. And neurons have very characteristic components to them. They have a cell body. They have a projection that leaves the cell body, which we call an axon, which is often thought to be the kind of output of the cell. And they've got a set of what we call dendrites, which are the kind of receptive parts of the cell. And neurons come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are very simple. So the cell body is covered in little dendrites that look like little hairs, and the output of an axon is a single axon. But some of them are deeply complex and have this really, really intricate architectures. But irrespective of all that complexity, one insight that people had many years ago was that you could treat the neuron a little bit like it was a little summing potential, so that what it's basically doing is the cell body's waiting around and saying, based on all the dendritic inputs that I'm getting from other neurons, if I just sum all of them up, and within a given window of time, which you can set as a computational scientist, if the number of inputs that came in was above a certain threshold, which again you define, I'm going to do an output, which will be a little spike, which from measuring them we know is the kind of a common thing that these neurons do. And so this was called an integrate and fire neuron, because you're integrating inputs and then firing. And it turns out that if you make that assumption, you can recapitulate a lot of really important features of a neuron's, or a sort of canonical neuron's behavior, with really, really simple mathematics that can then be scaled up. The reason that we wanted to get away from that a little bit was inspired by Matthew's work, which shows that this particular neuron, which is the main output of the cerebral cortex, it's a deep neuron with a really, really, really long, elaborated dendritic tree. It turns out that they don't behave as though they are perfectly integrated and fire neurons, because if there are inputs that come to their dendritic tree, those inputs actually have to traverse this incredibly long path all the way down to the cell body before they can have an impact. And it turns out that the brain has actually developed a number of really intricate mechanisms for determining whether or not that particular input can get propagated to actually have an impact on the cell body. So it's a little bit like saying, rather than being an integrate and fire, it's the integrate part is now much more complex. It's much more nuanced and it's context dependent. And it turns out that based on a bunch of empirical recordings, they can show that context dependency is deeply linked to both your state of consciousness, whether you're conscious of the world or not, but also your consciousness of contents, whether you're conscious of a particular thing happening. In this case, they were tweaking a whisker on a mouse and actually seeing whether or not the mouse would respond to that whisker tweak. And they can actually show that this particular coupling, essentially whether or not the signal was integrated, right? Because that's now not a given. It could depend on whether or not there's a coupling between these compartments, was actually deeply related to the animal's ability to respond. And so what that suggests is that we need to kind of soften this notion of integrate and fire to be more context dependent, more nuanced. And then in doing so, we might actually determine or discover some of the kind of interesting quirks that brains have had to learn in order to support the complexity of our conscious experiences as we're experiencing it right now.
Yeah, so
I think it's just scratching the surface. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I've been talking to some other neuroscientists. I guess it makes sense that neurons are actually incredibly complex, even a single neuron. And so it's like, okay, well, how can we simplify this to model it, and then what can we explain? And it makes sense. So it can explain a lot if you have almost this model where it sums and then fires but if it's kind of more complex, the way in which it chooses to sort of lead on to firing of other neurons and in this manner. I mean, as you say, I mean, would it make sense then because when we think about consciousness, it's interesting to link back to what we were saying. I mean, there could be sensory inputs, but then do you become consciously aware of it, right? That our attention and what we're conscious of maybe less than all we could be aware of, right? And so, is in thinking about neurons and the brain in this way, does it help tell us about things we miss in consciousness and what comes into consciousness versus what doesn't? Is there a way to make sense of these kinds of things?
Yeah, I think so. We haven't done the kind of requisite experiments to kind of confidently state that just yet. But one of the ways that we have been sort of pushing into this domain a little is by trying to use the backbone that we've done. So let me take a step back. In the work that we've done so far, the challenge that we've set ourselves is if we build a little model of these neurons and their connections to the thalamus or their connections to the brainstem, and we build it at scale, can we then take the output of that system and match it to, let's say, a monkey that is asleep and then wakes up naturally? Can we differentiate those different sort of domains where we know that the monkey is unconscious and we know that it's conscious? That should differentiate in our model? And we can, and then we could do the same thing with a human who was given an anesthetic drug, and we would expect that the human's conscious zone should look a little bit like the monkey's awake zone, and the human's anesthetized zone should look a little bit more like the sleep zone. And they look really nice and very similar to one another, and then we can make inferences about what's happening. But again, here we're not trying to say anything about being conscious of a particular thing. It's just whether or not you were conscious or not. So it's more of what we call the intransitive use of the verb consciousness. To get at the more transitive use of the verb, which I think is probably the more interesting one for people when they're thinking about it. Like, I'm conscious of the words that I'm using right now to describe this to you, or we're conscious of this conversation. It's much more nuanced and complex. You need more sophisticated tasks. And to get at the kinds of things you were mentioning about the kind of whether or not you notice something in your environment is really challenging to invent tasks for that have satisfying behavioral readouts. One way that people have made, I think, really compelling progress in this space is by designing tasks that take advantage of interesting quirks in our conscious experience. So one of them uses something known as binocular rivalry. And this is a really, really interesting phenomena where if you stare at an image, which the image is now being, different images are being presented to both eyes. So you can imagine something really, really boring, like a circle made of horizontal lines being fed to my left eye, and a circle of vertical lines being fed to my right eye. And imagine now I'm wearing little glasses so that one gets into one eye and one to the other, but there's no mixture. If you imagine that our perception is just a amalgamation of everything that comes into our eyes, you might imagine that what you see is a kind of blur, something like crosshatch circles, right? It turns out that that's not what you experience. What you actually experience is the left stimulus and then the right stimulus and the left and the right, and it switches back and forth somewhat randomly over time. So that you don't. So the important point is that despite the input to your eyes being exactly matched, there's a completely different conscious experience. And so people have studied this for years and years and years. There's a bunch of different really interesting laws that you can come up with that determine whether or not you'll see one of the items more or less, or they'll switch more frequently depending on how much they overlap, depending how similar they are, etc. Well, a really talented grad student in my lab, Chris White, actually was able to come up with a version of a model that used the same cellular constraints, the sort of breakdown and then integrate and fire type model, and some features of the thalamus to actually recapitulate really, really realistic binocular rivalry dynamics. So you can basically make a model of this system, which we know is related to consciousness being turned on and off, and noticing a whisker twig in a mouse. You can now make it do this really, really rich psychological experiment, which any one of us could go and sit and put on glasses and have this experience happen for them. But now we can make really sophisticated predictions about what ought to be happening in the brain when you're conscious or not of a particular stimulus. What causes the switch between you seeing the vertical grading and the horizontal grading? How can we speed it up and slow it down? And the reason we're excited by this is that this is sort of getting out ahead of the empirical science a little bit, because right now in the human brain, we don't have the ability to non-invasively record the human brain while people are performing this task at a sufficient level and precision to actually test these hypotheses in a human. And if we were to do it in a mouse, you can't at the moment ask a mouse whether or not it sees the stimulus left or right. You have to actually use something like an operationalization, like the amount of firing in a particular population, to determine whether or not they were conscious. But that's almost sort of putting the problem to the side, right? And it's saying, it's removing the subjective aspect of it in a way that we can easily ask a human. So we sort of imagine ourselves as sitting in this spot between really rich animal experiments, can do really precise recordings, and then really nuanced sort of psychological tasks, which are quite easy to do in a human, but very hard to do in an animal. And we're hoping that the computational models can sort of sit as a bridge between those two domains and create links.
Right, right. Because in a human, we could at least with a subjective experience, we can kind of ask and see like what actually are you experiencing here, and that is a
Really,
really
yeah.
right, right. Um,
But you couldn't do
but
that for a mouse particularly easily, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it's I guess as well. But I guess what the problem is I mean, a mouse at least has fewer neurons, and it's easier to sort of be more evasive and see what is going on in those neurons. Whereas
Yes.
in humans, I mean, I'm not up to date in all the measurements in the techniques we have in neuroscience, but it's kind of necessarily limited, and there's trade-offs in how we use them.
The analogy I would give is if you imagine trying to kind of record conversations amongst people in a city. Let's say you're in a city block. At the moment in humans, it's a little bit like putting a bunch of really, really high powered microphones up above the whole city. And so you can tell pretty confidently when there's, when it's a business hour or not, because there's going to be more hubbub. But you can't really say anything about an individual conversation. To do that, you can do that in a mouse. You could go all the way in and you could actually patch someone's cell phone and an individual person. You could put a microphone on an individual person. But when you do that, you're losing the ability to actually say much about what's happening in the whole city block. So you're having to make a choice about the resolution at which you analyze the brain's activity. And the more that you want to get down to the level of the individual neuron, the more invasive you have to be. You actually have to go in and perform surgery and, or perform an analysis that is deeply invasive. And that typically is outside the realm of ethics, acceptable ethics in a human neuroscience experiment. There's some blurred lines when people are undergoing neurosurgery, where you can actually have an invasive probe deep within someone's brain while they're performing very, very complicated tasks, let's say before they undergo neurosurgery. In these cases, they'll want to map out the really crucial parts of the brain for, let's say, something like language production. Or one of my favorite examples I heard at a conference once was an established concert violinist had a really awful brain tumor in her temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe's been associated with musicality and musical production. And she essentially did not want to undergo the surgery to remove the tumor if it meant that she could then afterwards not play the violin at the level that she was expected to. And so she actually took a violin with her into the surgery while the surgeons went around stimulating her brain to figure out which parts of the brain could actually stop her or not from performing the violin. And fortunately, there was a boundary between where the tumor was and the areas that were required for the violin performance. And they were actually able to successfully remove the tumor, which was an amazing outcome. But I digress. The point is that there's really a deep choice that you have to make as a neuroscientist. Which level of explanation are you currently looking to have your answers framed at? Would you like to make a statement about individual neuron types and the complexity of the circuits that they form? Would you like to make a statement about the whole brain and how it's functioning together? And these two are often really at odds of one another, so much so that the kinds of answers that you get often look really different. Individual neurons are really spiky. No two neurons look alike. They often have very different patterns to one another. When you go out to the level of the whole brain, the signals are really redundant. They look as though they are. They're really relatively smooth, and two regions look quite similar to one another. And so there's this real dichotomy, this real distinction. It turns out that some recent work we've done has shown that you can actually get those types of signatures out of a system that has what we call scale-free properties, which means that you essentially have a sort of similar type of a process occurring at multiple different scales that are all related to one another. And it's really new work, but it's exciting to think that we can start to kind of build stories and connections between these different scales that are otherwise so disparate to create more satisfying explanations for why whole brains can work the way that they do, given that they're built up of these parts that look so different than the whole.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, even part of what I wanted to ask you was kind of to what degree is there consensus in neuroscience about how the brain works, and it's in part like people will be studying different sort of levels of analysis, and so I mean, in part it's also the degree to which one can make sense of the links between, say, something at the neuron level versus at a whole brain level. And I mean, tell me a bit. I was reading some of your work about trying to think about just broader patterns in the brain and how we can think about sort of system level dynamics within it. Would you be able to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So So most of my training back from my PhD and into my postdoc was in human neuroimaging, where we're really at that kind of whole city block, or even broader, the whole city level. So what we do in these cases, we'll have people lie down in a scanner. So I there are lots of different techniques that people use to measure brain activity, but I was quite attracted to what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the leading version of functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI as it's called, actually measures a signal that's not exactly neural activity, like the spiking of neurons, but it's actually the blood. It's sensitive to the blood flow that actually is sent into a region which neurons require in order to spike and fire at a high level. And so what you can essentially do is you can have people lying down on their back in a scanner. It's a sort of a little tube, a little bit like a CT scanner. It's quite loud and noisy, but you can have them perform different kinds of tasks. So a little bit like that binocular rivalry experiment that I was explaining before, but you could imagine almost anything you can do lying down on your back, looking at a screen and then pushing different little buttons to respond. And what you then do is you get a sort of essentially a snapshot of where the blood flow was in their brain at a particular point in time. And you do that again and again and again, creating this kind of almost library, almost like a book of all the different configurations of blood flow in the brain. And then using statistical tests, you can then go afterwards and try to infer which parts of the brain were requiring more blood flow, and therefore the assumption is more neural activity during this particular part of your test or not. So to use the example of the binocular rivalry, you would do something like every time you switch between seeing the horizontal and the vertical gratings, push a button. Let's say you push your right middle finger when you see the vertical gratings, and then your right index finger when you see the horizontal gratings. And then you can go back afterwards and statistically ask, was there something that happened that predicted the switch, either right to left or left to right? And can I find a part of the brain that would tell me whether or not the person was perceiving left to right or not? And you can do all kinds of analyses on those. So I came along into that field after lots and lots of really brilliant work was done, sort of mapping out the sort of basic functional structure of the brain. Which parts of the brain respond to visual inputs, which parts respond when you're thinking hard, which parts respond when you're imagining something, which parts respond when you're experiencing a memory. The part that I was really interested in was how could they all work together? How is it that you can, as part of your day-to-day life, both see the world and hear the world and think about the world and imagine the world, but also remember the world, but also plan ahead for the world, and all these things, how could they come together? And this is a very, very different type of a problem to try to understand, because to understand this, you need to see people's brains when they're performing lots of different types of tasks, or performing tasks that are quite challenging. Like a typical cognitive task will require people to track an ongoing set of stimuli and then determine whether or not they fall into category 1 or category 2. And these are often really, really difficult challenges that you really have to sort of furrow your brow and think about. And to cut a long story short, we sort of took a really what we'd call a systems perspective. We tried to think of the brain, tried to sort of reimagine it like a big network of different interacting parts, and to think what's going on when you're performing these really challenging tasks, or when you're having to change between different tasks. And it turns out that you can kind of identify particular signatures of brain coordination, or the coordinated signals that are really indicative of performing different types of tasks, or performing really challenging tasks, that led us to think carefully about how a brain could perform these different things. And it's been a really long and interesting journey that it doesn't have a lot of really great take-home messages yet, I think, but it's led towards this notion of trying to think about how a brain could work at a whole brain level, which I think is a really interesting challenge for modern neuroscience to tackle.
Right, right. It's interesting that there maybe wouldn't naturally be a kind of take-home message, but it's nevertheless people. It's cool if you can find, oh, this region of the brain, it's 4 sensory inputs. This one is 4 language, right? But to kind of be able to have a way in which, okay, great, but how the brain has to switch between these tasks, and it has to do most of them simultaneously. So like, what is going on there? What kind of system level dynamics can kind of facilitate these things? Interesting.
The reason that I think it's super interesting, just to kind of follow on, is that it makes you really challenge some of the assumptions that you've brought to bear on kind of how a brain works. And you kind of rightly pointed out before that a lot of people would kind of equate human conscious experience or human consciousness and this kind of maybe this more kind of self-reflective capacity of like, I am a person right now having a conversation with another agent that has their own thoughts and feelings and experiences. We often equate that with activity in the cortex, in the cerebral cortex, the outer lining of the brain. But when you take seriously this notion of the fact that the only reason that I am conscious and aware right now is not just that I have a brain, but I have a brain inside a body that's active and engaged in a really complex world around me. You start to then ask yourself, well, how far could you get with just a cortex? And I think if you play even like a trivial thought experiment, what would happen if I took my cortex out and kind of put it in a dish? I don't think it's conscious anymore. It's something about being embedded within an agent that's in a world that deeply matters. And once you start playing that game, you start to notice that the cortex doesn't do much on its own. Like even beyond being embedded in a human in a world, it's deeply connected with other structures like the thalamus and the brainstem I mentioned before, but also others as well. The basal ganglia, the superior colliculus, the cerebellum. There's many other structures, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, that are deeply important for the kinds of things that it can do. And you start to realize, I think, fairly quickly that all the functions that we've wanted before to kind of look for answers just in the cortex were actually functions that required, I think, large parts of the rest of the brain. And if you then start to build those parts of the brain into your explanations for how the system could work, I think you come up with really different types of hypotheses about how the function emerges. And you end up having, I think, a really tough time really like localizing functions to a particular area. So let me use something trivial like visual perception. Visual perception is typically linked to an area of our cortex called V1 or visual one. It sits at the back of your brain in the occipital lobe. And, quite uncontroversially, and I'm sure in lots of textbooks around the world, it says something like, visual cortex is perception. There's a kind of link between them functionally. But if we think about it for a little bit, our ability to perceive the world also requires a conduit with the world. So we need our retina, we need our eyes to be able to see the world. And the first thing that the eyes do when the optic nerve leaves the back of the retina is it actually transmits information to the thalamus, to an area called the lateral geniculate nucleus, which then projects onto V1. But it doesn't just go there. It also goes to an area called the superior colliculus, which is also known as the tectum. In animals, it's actually part of the brainstem. It's actually sort of deep in the brainstem, just in front of the cerebellum, behind the thalamus. And the colliculus itself is a kind of its own processing station, which then projects back up to the cortex. So by the time the cortex has received its input, so is the colliculus. Now as the cortex projects back to the thalamus and back onto the cortex, it's now become this deeply interconnected mess of cables and wires all flinging back and forward to one another. And so all of these systems also need the brainstem to have injected the right kinds of chemicals, the right kinds of inputs to function for you to be conscious. So it feels silly in a way to call V1 the kind of seat of visual perception when what you really need is a retina and a thalamus and a brainstem and a colliculus and the rest of your cortex in order to be consciously aware of the world around you. And so taking this kind of notion of systems neuroscience seriously requires you to kind of shift the kinds of explanations that you're looking for when you're trying to come up with testable hypotheses about how the system works. Rather than asking where is a particular area, which area is lit up or is more active or something, you start to ask, how could this circuit function in an effective way in order to mediate conscious perception? And what would it look like if it wasn't? And I think that's a more satisfying way of framing the kinds of problems that we're interested in. It's certainly become the kind of modus operandi for my group and our collaborators, is to think at this sort of more circuit and then systems level of explanation.
When you say that, it makes me want to ask about, am I right in saying you wrote a paper with others about LLMs and consciousness within
Yeah,
sort of,
that was
yeah,
cool.
within, I mean, especially because we talk about then the complexity of the brain and to what degree is it a reasonable concern for AI today or AI of the future to think about consciousness and like, is it kind of intimately connected to what is required to make it and what kind of thing it is. So yeah.
Yeah, so we were actually at a really really awesome conference at Mila in Montreal just before Cosine a couple of years ago, back in 2023, and it was a really great conference. It was run probably around kind of when the sort of hype cycle around LLMs was really peaking. I think maybe a few weeks beforehand, the Google engineer had kind of put his love letter to his LLM online and was convinced it was conscious, and you know, there were all these really, you know, really, I think, hyper intelligent engineers and scientists at places like Google and Facebook and other institutes that were really trying to keep up with the rapid progress that was being made in that space, where they would come with a discerning eye and they would say something like, um, if this LLM is conscious, let's take this notion seriously. Here is the test that I would provide to it to determine. And they would use something like a test that we would give to a human to determine if they were conscious, sort of almost inventing Turing tests on the fly as they were going. And they found that, you know, oftentimes the current version of the model they were using couldn't pass that test. But then with a few other tweaks, it would, all of a sudden would. And they go, oh man, now we need another test. And they basically were just running out of tests that they could come up with. And I was sitting in the audience talking to Matthew, who I mentioned before, and another collaborator, Jan Aru, about these kinds of challenges and what was going on. And I think we were all deeply skeptical that something like an LLM, which is really just sort of stacked linear algebra trained in a particular way, really could mimic the complexity of a sort of nervous system. You know, we're all kind of neurobiology dorks and really kind of fascinated by the complexity of the nervous system. And it just felt a little bit like a magic trick. Like, here was this really, really clear demonstration that training a sophisticated but yet really simplistic compared to the complexity of a brain architecture on just billions and billions of examples of data can give rise to these examples that kind of pass our intuitive filter. They basically make us feel as though they were conscious rather than it actually being conscious. But then when we sat down to really try to figure out where we would think the problems lay, the differences between the two, it really occurred to us that at the end of the day, a couple of the things that we think are really special about nervous systems are probably the kinds of problems that are going to be knocked over in not too distant future. The first one is that LLMs are really different in terms of their architecture to the human brain, but there's really nothing stopping people from building LLMs or neural nets that look like a brain. That will come in time. People that take advantage of the kind of advances in the forefront of neuroscience will I think, have lots of benefits that'll be really fun to follow. The second is that LLMs at the moment are fed, you know, particular input sequences and have a certain output sequence that's constrained. So we feed them at the moment corpuses of text and we ask them to output keystrokes, let's say, on, you know, text, or we feed them corpuses of YouTube data and we get them to put back pixels. But there's nothing stopping them from trying to mimic the complexity of our retina and our cochlea and our sensory stimuli, or even go even better and do higher fidelity sensory inputs and outputs and motor outputs. There's nothing stopping them doing that. But the thing that really, I think, struck us as something that's fundamentally different between a neural network and an actual biological network of a brain is that there's really no skin in the game for a neural network. The example that Matthew liked to give was that if you had an LLM in front of you and you sat down and you wrote to the LLM, I'd like you to wager on whether or not someone will use a particular weird sentence. Let's say that they had a sentence, "I love fudge," and they just wanted to say this sentence, something completely random. How much do you want to wager that that sentence will come out in the next hour in a conversation? And your punishment, if you're wrong, is that I'm going to lock you in a cupboard for 10,000 years. If you ask this of a human being, no one would take this bet, right? It's a ridiculous bet. The payoff is way too severe for no reward whatsoever. But an LLM will happily take it because it has no skin in the game. It doesn't care whatsoever what the outcome is. And we think that something that really draws a line, admittedly in a slightly farcical way, between the living and the non-living networks. something about a biological brain is that it's embedded in a body, in a world, and there are consequences to its actions in a way that is really deeply and trivially not true for a neural network as currently constructed. And we think that there's something deeply different about those two that actually forms the basis of the difference between consciousness in the case of biological organisms and non-consciousness in the case of a neural network. And that, is a little unfair of us. It's sort of pushing the problem more towards the philosophers, but I think they're who we need to actually make deeper progress on this front. In essence, what it's saying is that consciousness is really closer to a problem of agency and biological life versus non-life than it is some kind of inherent feature of a network as constructed in a particular way or not. And I think that's probably the most satisfying answer that we could have given the coffee that we
Yeah.
had for breakfast.
Yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, as you say, I mean, okay, we have LLMs, and okay, they are lower in complexity now, but okay, we with time we could copy the structure of the brain and some other features, but then it's still, again, like with these tests that they're doing, it's like they make a new test and a new test and say, oh, it's like, okay, well, what are these tests? Fair enough, we can kind of feels like, I mean, it's just think about even how we evolved to like perceive whether someone is conscious or aware, right? Like, it probably, why would we like be constantly sort of doubting whether someone is conscious? Like, we're used to seeing humans, right? And we don't just keep doubting when we see, reasonable like communication, right? And so I can see why we're kind of almost tricked in a way to thinking that it's conscious. But nevertheless, I also would, as you say, it's helpful to think, okay, but like, let's take it seriously. Could it be conscious? And it's interesting because some other people that I've talked to have kind of thought about, well, I mean, okay, but like, does one need the kind of ability to care about the world in order to sort of be able to seek out information, to have drives, or even I think about Mark Solm's work about the importance of emotions in consciousness. Like, what is the, you just, like, maybe maybe there could be some code, or just, it's like, oh no, I do not want to be locked in a cupboard for 10,000 years. That's suboptimal. But it's like, what does it really feel that that's a bad thing? Like, it's, versus for us, we have drives, we'll die, if that happens. And then it's
Yeah,
not going to work out for us. Yeah. Yeah.
I think if I put my kind of prognosticator hat on, and I'm not a big fan of prognosticating because I think it's a really quick way to be wrong publicly, but I think that we're going to be able to model and recapitulate, and we probably already do to a large extent, a lot of the sort of features of conscious experience and the benefits of like functional benefits of conscious experience far, far, far before we'll be able to actually recreate artificial consciousness in an agent. I think that's a deeply difficult problem. That's sort of I'm a functionalist at the end of the day. I think that there's something about the sort of biological organization that really deeply matters, and I think we have so much to learn about how cells work and how the genetic code works and how living organisms work, that many of the problems are going to have to be solved before we can say anything at all sensible about how consciousness actually works at that kind of the difference between subjective and objective level. Whereas beforehand, we'll be able to say, hey, when you're conscious of the world, you can, differentiate something like this, like that, and here's how the visual system might do that. I think we'll actually get a lot of computational benefits from kind of reverse engineering the visual system. And I think we already kind of do. Convolutional neural nets use a lot of the same tricks that brains use about collapsing and then expanding dimensionality to be able to create really good classification accuracy. So I think a lot of the sort of tricks that brains have learned to do these things, which relate to consciousness, have already had computational benefits, and that'll happen long before we can really discover what's at the kind of crux of the difference between a conscious versus a non-conscious agent.
If you'd like to listen to more podcasts like this, then maybe check out one of these recommended here, or subscribe to my channel if you're new. Thank you for listening to this podcast.